All right, and you guys have a lot of questions about the scorching summer heat in Europe, and we're following your clicks and curiosity, and you guys want to know more about the temperatures over there and if its infrastructure can handle the heat. So let's break it down. We've got Linsey Lopez up first, then Jeff Schlegelmilch. Y'all, thank you so much for being here. Let's start with that heat wave beating down on Europe right now. Our meteorologist, Linsey Lopez, joins me with the forecast and conditions.
Hi there.
Leslie, this is Europe's fifth heat wave this year. What are temperatures actually looking like in Europe right now?
Yeah, let me show you. Right now over in Europe, we're looking at temperatures across the board really heating up. This is a sweltering summer. This is where we're seeing some heat that for today will be the hottest of the year in places, portions of the UK. Look at London, 93 degrees, Paris, 105 degrees, 102 in Madrid, over in Milan, 97, 102 degrees out towards Rome. Now that heat wave is going to last all the way through the weekend, slowly getting cooler, but still remaining quite warm. And so again, this is going to be another round of heat for the area.
Yeah, Leslie, you can't go on social media right now without seeing those European summer vacations. They're all the rave. But heat waves and wildfires at the same exact time, how are we dealing with both?
You know, it is this time of year that we would see those wildfires, we would see the heat waves, but I don't want to discount how different it has been over the last several years. The continent of Europe has increased in temperature by 4.5 degrees. I mean, that's huge since industrialization has started. So as we're looking at some of our scientific research, as we're going through the Natural Academy of Sciences, they attribute most of this heat to human amplified climate change. So this is where we're seeing extensive heat waves, we're seeing intensity and also frequency. And that's all attributed to, again, human-related climate change.
Yeah, Leslie, break this down a little bit more for me, because, I mean, parts of the country here, we get some of those triple-digit temperatures as well. But when we hear about it in Europe, it just sounds so much more dire. What are the concerns for people who live in Europe and people traveling there during these kinds of weather conditions? And how does it sort of differentiate from what we experience here in the States?
You know, I do want to be careful answering that. In the United States, the #1 heat-related death is attributed to, or weather-related deaths are attributed to heat. Now, that's here in the United States. We have air conditioning, we have the infrastructure for air conditioning, and yet that still remains the #1 cause. As we're getting into Europe, they do not historically have the infrastructure. They haven't adopted air conditioning like we have here in the United States. Electricity is a lot more expensive in Europe. In addition to that, they don't have the power grid infrastructure set up for everybody just turning to air conditioning. Over the next few summers, perhaps they could start to develop that and move into that direction. But currently, that is not what they deal with. So, of course, when we talk about their heat waves gripping the area, the #1 reason why this is in headlines is because there's very little relief just because of the lack of adoption of air conditioning.
Leslie, I appreciate that context. Thank you so much. Let's now bring in Columbia Climate School Associate Professor of Practice, Jeff Schlegelmilch. Jeff, thank you so much for joining us. Can Europe's infrastructure handle these extreme weather conditions? How is this working?
Yeah, I think this is one of the challenges we're seeing everywhere, right? Is that climate change is outpacing the infrastructure. The world that infrastructure was built for is changing very rapidly, and particularly in Europe. So I think the short answer is not really, right? A lot of Europe was built to be cold, to hold the heat within buildings, to not have a need for air conditioning. And so turning that over on a dime is not something that can be done very quickly. When we talk about wildfires, you know, areas that have not experienced a lot of wildfires don't necessarily have the systems, the equipment, or the building codes to actually prevent wildfires. And these are things that take time, and time that's increasingly running out.
Yeah, Jeff, you mentioned the AC systems in these buildings weren't necessarily built for AC systems. We're seeing a lot of that on search. Why some European countries don't actually have reliable AC? What do you make of that?
Well, you didn't need it. And even if we look within the United States, if we look at the cities where we would actually expect to see the most excess deaths under different climate change projections into the future, it's actually more in the north of the United States than the south. And this is very similar in Europe, right? Because it's been a lot colder, and so it just wasn't built to have air conditioning. If you're down in Austin, Texas, or Dallas, or Florida, it's hot all the time. And so as a result of that, a lot of that infrastructure has already been built in. It's going to get hotter. It's going to put more strain on things, but there's a baseline there. So we're seeing the same thing in parts of Europe here, too, where all of a sudden you have this area that just wasn't hot enough to cross that threshold. Now that it's crossing that threshold and becoming very dangerous, it's actually a much larger problem than sort of scaling something that might have already been there.
Yeah, Jeff, I'm curious if you'll say the quiet part out loud. Would you say that Europe is facing a climate crisis? And what is the EU actually doing about it?
I would say the world is facing a climate crisis, and Europe is no exception to that. The EU is taking steps to do this, just like many other countries. The problem is that we're late to the table on this, that infrastructure takes decades to put in place, building codes take decades to put in place. And crisis is the right term for this because we need the type of marshaling of resources, political leadership, fiscal leadership, and really whole of society leadership to address this problem on timescales that are just not going to be accommodated through normal policymaking and procurement processes.
I see. And so the World Economic Forum says that climate-proofing infrastructure is central to economic sustainability. What do you think that actually looks like, and how could Europe actually step into making sure that these things are a reality?
Well, first and foremost, it's about stuff, right? We have a power grid that's going to power all of these air conditioners that we want to put in. And so right off the bat, we need to have a power grid that's going to be able to manage that. And we've seen blackouts in Europe and the US under increased strain as a result of that. But we also have to look at social infrastructure. This puts tremendous strain on the services that we're all exposed to. And frankly, if you have more money, you have more options. And some of the biggest determinants of how people do in disasters of all kinds, including heat, has to do with those social connections and those social safety nets. So I think we also, as we look to infrastructure, we can't forget how vital and how much more strain these social protection systems are going to come under as well.
Jeff, really appreciate you joining us and breaking this down, man. Really appreciate your time.